Today, more than 8 billion humans walk the Earth. Our cities light up the night sky, planes crisscross the globe, and satellites beam signals across the heavens. We build skyscrapers that scrape the clouds, we explore the depths of the oceans, and we dream of colonizing other planets. Humanity dominates Earth in a way no species ever has before. But the story wasn't always like this. If you rewind the clock nearly a million years, the picture looks shockingly different. Our ancestors weren't thriving in bustling cities or sending rockets to the stars. They were clinging to life by the barest thread imaginable. Around 900,000 years ago, something happened that reduced the human population to a level smaller than most modern villages. Scientists now believe that the number of breeding individuals, those capable of passing on their genes, fell to about 1280. Not 128,000, not 1.28 million, but barely more than the student body of a small high school. Imagine all of humanity, reduced to a handful of scattered families struggling to survive in a brutal, changing world. That's the reality our ancestors faced. Their survival wasn't guaranteed. In fact, the odds were heavily stacked against them. And yet, against all logic, they endured. This is the story of that survival. 117,000 years of hanging on in the face of unimaginable adversity. A saga written not in ink, but in DNA, buried deep within every one of us alive today. For a long time, scientists suspected something strange in our past. Compared to other animals, humans are oddly uniform in their genetic diversity. Chimpanzees, who live in small, scattered groups across Africa, carry more genetic variation than all 8 billion humans combined. That's not normal. It's a signature of what biologists call a population bottleneck. A bottleneck happens when a species' population crashes to very low levels, losing huge amounts of genetic variation. When numbers are that small, every birth, every death, every pairing matters. Entire traits can vanish simply because no one carrying them survived to reproduce. For decades, researchers guessed humans must have gone through some kind of bottleneck, but no one knew when or how severe it was. Then, in 2023, a team led by scientists at the Chinese Academy of Sciences published a groundbreaking study. They analyzed the DNA of thousands of modern people from around the globe, running it backward through time using powerful computational tools. The results stunned everyone. Roughly 900,000 years ago, the genetic signatures collapsed. The data screamed that humanity's ancestors had been reduced to just over 1,000 breeding individuals. And this wasn't a brief crisis. The bottleneck lasted for about 117,000 years. That's longer than our own species, Homo sapiens, has existed. Suddenly, what had once been speculation became undeniable fact. Humanity came within a hair's breadth of extinction long before we ever wrote history, built cities, or tamed fire. When a population falls to numbers this low, the danger isn't just predators, climate, or hunger. The danger is mathematics. Biologists call it the extinction vortex. In small populations, genetic variation shrinks, inbreeding increases, and harmful mutations build up like rust on an old machine. Random disasters, disease, drought, even a single bad season can wipe out huge fractions of the group. Once a population dips below about 1,000 individuals, most species never recover. They simply vanish, erased from the earth forever. By all logic, our ancestors should have met the same fate. And yet, somehow, they didn't. For more than 100,000 years, generation after generation, they kept the flame of humanity alive. We don't know their names, we don't know where exactly they lived, but we know they existed because we exist. Every person alive today is proof that those 1,000 or so early humans endured the vortex and emerged on the other side. The odds were so slim, it almost defies belief. But their survival wasn't just luck. It was persistence, adaptation, and perhaps a handful of critical innovations that allowed them to outlast the perfect storm threatening to erase them. What drove our ancestors to the edge? The answer lies. The first generation of survivors within the refuge faced a brutal reality. They were a scattered band, perhaps no more than a few hundred adults of breeding age, raising children in an unforgiving climate. Every day was a gamble, whether they would find food, whether they would drink clean water, whether predators or rival groups would strike in the night. The rhythm of life was survival, nothing more. Parents passed down knowledge, not through writing, but through observation, gestures, and crude vocalizations. The ability to remember where edible plants grew, where dangerous animals prowled, or when the rains might come meant the difference between life and death. Children grew quickly, not because they were forced to, but because childhood was short. Illnesses that today would be minor were often fatal. Many never reached adulthood. Those who did became the guardians of fragile knowledge carried forward from one season to the next. And yet amid the danger, bonds formed. Cooperation was essential. Small groups that shared food, watched over each other's young, and worked together to hunt had a better chance of survival. This was not yet the modern human family as we know it, but the seeds of cooperation, the glue that would one day allow civilizations to flourish, were already being laid in those fragile first generations. Imagine waking each morning in that ancient world. The air is dry, the horizon hazy with dust. You stir in a shallow shelter made from branches and grass, the embers of last night's fire faintly glowing. The first task is always water. Without it, nothing else matters. Small bands traveled miles each day to reach streams or pools that hadn't dried up. Children and the elderly often remained behind while the strongest gathered water, carrying it back in crude containers made from animal hides or large shells. Hunting was perilous. Spears were little more than sharpened sticks hardened in fire. Prey animals were fast, strong, and dangerous. Early humans often targeted small game, hares, lizards, tortoises, because larger animals could kill a hunter as easily as be hunted. Plant foods, roots, and tubers provided a crucial buffer against hunger. Though drought made even these scarce, nights were the most dangerous. Fires, if they had them, were kept burning to ward off predators. Families huddled close, not only for warmth, but for safety. The darkness was alive with the sounds of hyenas, leopards, and giant crocodiles lurking in rivers. The daily struggle was relentless. And yet, this was the crucible in which humanity's resilience was forged. One of the most important developments during this time may have been the control of fire. Archaeological evidence suggests that humans began using fire more systematically around 800,000 years ago, which overlaps with the bottleneck period. Fire changed everything. It allowed food to be cooked, making it easier to digest and unlocking more nutrients for meat and plants. It extended the day, giving people time to socialize, to learn, and to teach long after the sun went down. It provided protection against predators who feared the flames. Most importantly, fire offered warmth during freezing nights when temperatures plummeted. Imagine the relief of a small band of survivors gathered around a crackling fire after a day of exhaustion and fear. The flames were more than heat and light, they were hope. Fire also shaped social life. Around the fire, stories began to form. Not stories as we know them today, but fragments of memory. Warnings about dangers, lessons passed on to children. In a world where survival required cooperation, fire became the center of community, the symbol of continuity in a fragile, uncertain existence. Without it, survival for 117,000 years might have been impossible. The most valuable resource our ancestors carried wasn't stone tools or even fire, it was knowledge. In a population so small, the death of one elder could mean the loss of generations of survival wisdom. Where to find edible plants, when migrations of animals would occur, which water holes stayed reliable even in dry seasons. These were the kinds of information that determined survival, and so each generation became the living library of the last. Children absorbed lessons by watching, imitating, and listening to the adults around them. Play wasn't just play, it was training. Practicing how to throw a spear, how to carry food, how to recognize animal tracks. Those who learned quickly lived. Those who often didn't survive long enough to pass on their genes. Over time, this cycle created a selective pressure favoring memory, learning, and communication. Even before complex language, the ability to signal clearly, to teach effectively, and to share knowledge became invaluable. Each generation refined the survival toolkit not only through tools, but through minds. In this way, the bottleneck acted like an evolutionary filter, pressing our ancestors toward greater intelligence and cooperation. Despite their persistence, extinction hovered constantly over these small bands. Entire groups may have been wiped out by drought, disease, or conflict, leaving no trace. The fossil record from this time is nearly empty, reflecting how few people there were. With only about 1280 breeding individuals in total, humanity was one epidemic, one natural disaster, or one unlucky streak away from vanishing forever. This constant threat shaped their existence. Life was short. Few lived past their 30s. Infant mortality was high. Every birth was precious, and every death was a devastating blow to the survival of the group. And yet they endured. They endured through 117,000 years of uncertainty. They endured when other species in similar situations disappeared forever. What made them different? Was it fire? Was it intelligence? Was it sheer luck? Perhaps it was all of these. What matters is that against every odd, they carried the fragile thread of humanity through a dark and hostile age. Without them, there would be no us. Their struggle is our inheritance. Their survival is our beginning. While the first generations clung to crude, sharpened sticks and broken stones, later groups began refining their tools. This was no sudden leap. Innovation in prehistory moved at a glacial pace. Yet, in the span of thousands of years, small improvements began to make life more manageable. Stones were chipped deliberately to create sharper edges. These became hand axes, multi-purpose tools used to cut meat, break bones, dig for roots, and even defend against predators. The use of bone and antler added new possibilities. A pointed bone could be used as an awl to pierce hides, or as a fishing spear. These innovations didn't happen everywhere at once. Some groups may have lived and died without ever discovering them. But across the generations, ideas spread slowly, carried by migration, by intermarriage, or simply by the survival of groups who had mastered better techniques. The difference between life and death was often as simple as having a sharper edge. Every small improvement meant food could be gathered faster, shelters could be built stronger, and enemies could be held at bay more effectively. These slow refinements laid the foundation for the technological ingenuity that would one day define humanity. Shelter was never permanent. Small groups moved constantly, following food and water. But over time, certain patterns emerged. People learned to return to the same caves, the same riverbanks, or the same seasonal grazing lands year after year. These places became familiar, almost like homes, even if they were abandoned for months at a time. Natural shelters such as caves offered protection from wind, rain, and predators. Where caves weren't available, people built temporary structures from branches, leaves, and animal hides. These were fragile but sufficient for short stays. The act of building, however, was significant. It showed planning, foresight, and cooperation. Over thousands of years, humans developed a kind of mental map of their environment, understanding where resources were most plentiful at different times. These patterns of movement were the earliest steps toward the concept of territory and belonging. Though far removed from cities or villages, these semi-regular shelters represented the beginning of a rhythm that tied human life to the land in a deeper way. If one thread runs through every generation of survival during this bottleneck, it is cooperation. A lone human was easy prey, but a group of 10, 20, or 50 could stand against much greater challenges. Hunting in groups allowed for the ambush of larger prey, like wild horses or young elephants. Gathering in groups made it possible to carry heavy loads of firewood or water over long distances. Defending in groups made predators think twice about attacking. But cooperation required trust, and trust required some system of rules, even if unspoken. Early humans developed social hierarchies, with leaders emerging based on strength, wisdom, or the ability to provide. Conflict within groups was inevitable, but those who managed to settle disputes and keep harmony ensured the survival of their people. Cooperation extended to child rearing as well. Infants were vulnerable for years, requiring constant care. It was likely that mothers, sisters, and even unrelated women helped raise children collectively, sharing the burden of survival. This pattern, sometimes called alloparenting, is still seen among modern hunter-gatherers. Through cooperation, fragile groups of survivors became resilient networks that could weather the harsh realities of their world. The climate of the bottleneck era was far from stable. Ice ages advanced and retreated, rainfall shifted, and entire ecosystems collapsed or regenerated over the span of centuries. Each shift posed new challenges. When grasslands expanded, herds of grazing animals flourished, providing more food, but also attracting predators. When drought struck, plants withered, rivers shrank, and hunger stalked every camp. Early humans didn't have the luxury of storing food in bulk, so their survival depended on quick adaptation. Groups that could shift their diets, expand their range, or learn to exploit new resources fared better. Some evidence suggests humans became more omnivorous during this time, expanding from primarily meat and plants to include insects, shellfish, and anything remotely edible. Climate forced flexibility, and flexibility became a defining trait of our species. This adaptability, forged during the bottleneck, became humanity's secret weapon. Where other species perished because they could not adjust, humans endured, surviving in environments as different as cold tundra, arid deserts, and lush forests. Though survival consumed most energy, small sparks of what we now call culture began to emerge. The use of pigments like ochre, found at ancient sites, suggests that even in these desperate times, humans felt a need to express, to mark, to symbolize. Perhaps ochre was used for body paint in rituals, or perhaps for decorating tools or shelters. Music, too, may have had its roots here. The rhythmic beating of sticks or stones could have been more than just noise. It could have been a way to bond, to coordinate, to soothe. Around the fire, people may have begun to share not only practical lessons, but also myths, however simple, explanations of the sun, the animals, or the storms. These early forms of symbolic thought didn't feed stomachs or fend off predators, but they fed the mind and spirit. Culture, even in its most primitive form, bound groups together. It gave them identity, meaning, and cohesion beyond simple survival. In this way, culture was as essential as fire or tools in carrying humanity through the bottleneck. One of the quiet revolutions during the survival struggle was the evolution of communication. Early humans already had vocal calls, gestures, and facial expressions, but in the bottleneck years, the pressure to survive forced them to refine these into more structured forms. Imagine trying to coordinate a group hunt without words, only pointing, grunting, and miming. Now imagine the breakthrough when groups developed consistent signals, a shared code that everyone understood. Over thousands of years, this simple code grew richer. A gesture for water, a sound for danger, a shout for fire. These primitive words weren't poetry, but they were powerful. They allowed plans to be shared before action, warnings to be shouted across distance, and knowledge to be passed to children with more precision. Communication became a tool just as vital as fire or stone. It meant fewer mistakes, fewer deaths from misunderstanding. Over time, communication became not just about survival, but about bonding. Around the fire, these early humans shared not only instructions but feelings. Grief when someone died, joy when a hunt succeeded. This expansion of language was the seed that would later blossom into full speech and complex thought. Although the bottleneck forced humanity into a small refuge, it wasn't a single place. Groups wandered within ranges that were habitable at different times. Some might have hugged river valleys where water and vegetation persisted, while others clung to coastal zones where fish and shellfish offered more reliable food. Migration wasn't a choice, it was survival. When resources ran out in one spot, the group had to move. This constant movement left its mark. People became expert trackers, reading the faintest signs of animals and seasons. They learned which plants bloomed after rains, which trees bore fruit, and which landscapes were death traps. Over generations, migration shaped not only their bodies, favoring endurance and stamina, but their minds, instilling memory and navigation skills. Humans became creatures of the journey, defined not by one place, but by the ability to adapt to many. This wandering within a limited refuge was the training ground for the far greater migrations that would come tens of thousands of years later, when humans finally spread out of Africa to every corner of the planet. Modern genetics has revealed a startling truth. Nearly all humans alive today descend from those tiny groups of survivors. Our DNA carries the fingerprints of the bottleneck. Certain genes became widespread not because they were superior, but because there were so few people to pass them on. A rare trait in a small group could, over thousands of years, become the default for all humanity. One of the most famous examples is the fusion of two ancient ape chromosomes into what is now human chromosome 2. This fusion event became universal in humans because everyone alive today descends from the carriers who survived the bottleneck. In other words, quirks of those 1280 survivors became the blueprint for the entire species. The bottleneck also reduced genetic diversity. Compared to many other animals, humans are surprisingly similar at the genetic level. Two chimpanzees in Africa can be more different genetically than two humans from opposite sides of the world. This uniformity is the echo of that ancient near-extinction event. Our ancestors passed through the narrowest gate, and their genes alone carried forward. For all the intelligence, cooperation, and adaptability of early humans, luck must have played a massive role in their survival. A volcanic eruption could have destroyed a group's water source. A disease could have swept through a camp. A predator could have wiped out children before they reached adulthood. And yet somewhere, some small band avoided disaster each time. Survival wasn't guaranteed. It was a razor's edge. Entire lineages likely vanished, their knowledge and bloodlines lost forever. We only exist because a few groups happened to be in the right place at the right time. Perhaps a hidden cave kept them safe during a storm. Perhaps a migration led them to a river that didn't dry up. Perhaps a random mutation gave someone a stronger immune system. Luck is often overlooked in history, but during this bottleneck, it may have been as critical as fire or tools. It reminds us that our existence is not just the result of human ingenuity, but also of chance. The dice of nature rolled 1,000 times, and against all odds, we came out alive. After tens of thousands of years of scraping by, there were hints of recovery. Populations, though still fragile, began to grow slowly. Groups that had once numbered in the dozens expanded into the hundreds. As numbers grew, so did possibilities. More people meant more innovation, more cooperation, and more resilience against disaster. If one group was wiped out, others remained. The slow increase in population density also meant more contact between groups. Knowledge that had once been isolated could now spread more widely. Better tools, better shelters, and better survival strategies. The refuge was still harsh, but humanity was adapting, learning to master it rather than simply endure it. By the end of this long bottleneck, humanity had been reshaped. We were no longer just clever apes scraping by on the margins. We were becoming a species uniquely prepared to thrive in diverse and unpredictable environments. The stage was being set for the great expansions of the future. As populations grew slightly, humans began to form stronger group identities. For most of the bottleneck, survival had been so precarious that there was little time for anything beyond food, fire, and shelter. But once groups reached a stable size of perhaps 50 to 100 people, something new emerged: culture. Humans started to see themselves not only as individuals but as members of a tribe. They had shared customs, unique ways of making tools, distinct styles of shelter, and particular hunting strategies. These differences created identity markers. A stranger from another group could often be recognized by the way they napped, stoned, or painted their skin. Identity mattered because it built trust within the group and distinguished allies from outsiders. It also gave people a sense of belonging, a reassurance that even in a harsh world, they were part of something larger than themselves. This deep-seated tribalism, born in the bottleneck, still echoes today in the way humans form nations, religions, and communities. In such a dangerous world, loss was constant. People died from accidents, predators, hunger, and disease. Over time, groups developed rituals to cope with death and to honor survival. The earliest rituals were likely simple: placing a body in a shallow pit, covering it with stones, perhaps leaving tools or food alongside it. These practices suggest a belief, or at least a hope, that life continued in some form after death. Rituals served a practical purpose too. They bound the living together. When the group gathered around a burial, grief was shared and solidarity was strengthened. Rituals also extended to survival practices. Before a dangerous hunt, people may have painted their bodies with ochre or repeated chants meant to bring luck. Around the fire, myths and stories explain why the world was harsh but survivable. These rituals weren't mere superstition. They created structure in chaos, order in uncertainty, and unity in fear. They allowed small groups to face overwhelming odds with courage. As generations passed, these early groups evolved into proto-societies. Leadership became more defined. In times of crisis, certain individuals, perhaps the strongest hunter, the wisest elder, or the most persuasive speaker, took charge. Decisions about when to migrate, where to hunt, or how to resolve disputes became collective but guided. Over time, these roles may have stabilized into early forms of hierarchy. A skilled leader could ensure group survival for years, while a poor one could doom them. Importantly, these proto-societies didn't only revolve around dominance. Cooperation was the glue. Everyone had roles: hunters, foragers, toolmakers, firekeepers, child caregivers. Survival required every role, and each was respected in its own way. This balanced form of society, egalitarian, cooperative, yet adaptable, would later serve as the foundation for more complex human communities. Long before cities or kingdoms, the seeds of social order were planted here, in the bottleneck. During the bottleneck, stories became a crucial survival tool. Storytelling wasn't entertainment. It was memory, education, and strategy all rolled into one. Without writing, knowledge had to be preserved in the human mind, and the best way to make it stick was through narrative. A story about a great hunt carried instructions on animal behavior. A tale about a flood warned future generations about the dangers of certain landscapes. Myths about fire encoded safety rules. Don't let the flames die, don't wander too far at night. Storytelling also shaped identity. Each group developed legends about their origins, their heroes, and their struggles. Around the fire, these stories bonded listeners across generations. The old instructed the young, and the young imagined futures shaped by these tales. Over thousands of years, storytelling refined human imagination. It trained the brain to think in terms of cause and effect, what if, and long-term planning. In many ways, it was the spark that prepared humans for abstract thought, the very capacity that later led to art, religion, and science. If one word defined humanity during the bottleneck, it was endurance. Endurance wasn't only physical. The ability to walk miles across barren terrain or go days with little food, it was also mental. The culture that developed during these years emphasized patience, resilience, and persistence. Failures were common. A hunt gone wrong, a shelter destroyed, a fire lost. But the response was always the same: try again, adapt, endure. This mindset became embedded in human psychology. Unlike many other species, which collapse quickly when conditions worsen, humans developed an almost stubborn refusal to give up. The culture of endurance also meant preparing children to face hardship from an early age. Skills were taught not as luxuries, but as survival essentials. Every child learned how to make fire, track animals, find food, and stay close to the group. By the time they reached adulthood, survival skills were second nature. This relentless training forged generations of humans who were not only survivors, but innovators, capable of turning struggle into strength. The control of fire was one of humanity's greatest turning points, and during the bottleneck years, fire became the dividing line between survival and extinction. Earlier humans may have stumbled upon fire left by lightning or volcanic eruptions, but now survival demanded mastery. Groups that learned to keep embers alive, transport them, and eventually spark flames themselves had a huge advantage. Fire turned tough roots into edible meals, killed parasites in meat, and provided warmth during freezing nights. Most importantly, fire extended the day. Instead of ending work at sunset, humans could gather, plan, and tell stories late into the night. Fire also created safety. Predators that once stalked the edges of camps now kept their distance, wary of the glowing barrier. Over thousands of years, fire became central not only to survival but to culture. Each group developed ways to tend flames, pass the skill to children, and even weave fire into myths. Some may have seen it as a gift from the sky, others as a spirit that needed feeding. But no matter the interpretation, fire became humanity's greatest ally in the darkness. Alongside fire, tool-making advanced dramatically. Early stone flakes gave way to more carefully shaped hand axes, scrapers, and spear tips. These tools weren't just sharper, they were more efficient, saving time and energy. Over generations, humans learned to select better stone, refine their knapping techniques, and pass these skills down with precision. The improvement of tools meant better hunting, better shelters, and better clothing. Scrapers turned animal hides into durable garments against the cold. Spears allowed hunting of larger animals with less risk. Over time, tools became symbols of knowledge and status. A finely crafted axe wasn't just useful, it marked its maker as skilled and respected. Innovation spread slowly but steadily, and each breakthrough rippled through small groups. Unlike instincts, which are fixed, tools could be reinvented every generation, accelerating cultural evolution. During the bottleneck, this meant each small gain, sharper blades, stronger spears, could tip the balance between life and death. At first, humans relied on caves, overhangs, and natural refuges. But caves weren't always available, and as groups grew, they needed alternatives. Slowly, humans began building their own shelters. Branches, hides, and stones were arranged into protective structures. These weren't permanent houses. Nomadic life meant moving often, but they represented the first steps toward controlling the environment. A shelter made the difference between freezing to death and surviving another winter night. Building shelters also fostered teamwork. Groups had to gather materials, assign tasks, and work together to finish before darkness fell. Shelter making became a ritual, repeated whenever a group moved to a new area. Over time, designs improved. Some shelters resisted wind better, others trapped heat more effectively. While fragile and temporary, these early constructions planted the seed of an idea that humans could shape the world, not just endure it. This growing sense of control, combined with fire and tools, laid the groundwork for the villages and cities of the distant future. For tens of thousands of years, humanity's range had shrunk to a few fragile safe zones. But with fire, tools, and shelters, groups cautiously expanded. They ventured into harsher climates, survived longer droughts, and hunted in riskier regions. Each small expansion tested limits. Could they survive a colder valley? Could they cross a desert patch? Could they adapt to thinner forests? Many attempts failed. Groups vanished into landscapes too unforgiving, but some succeeded. Over time, the map of human survival widened. Expansion also meant encounters with other human groups. Sometimes these meetings led to sharing knowledge, mates, tools, but other times to conflict. Resources were scarce, and groups fiercely protected them. Expansion was not a steady march, but a cycle of pushes and retreats, failures and breakthroughs. Yet the direction was clear. Humans were no longer trapped. They were beginning to reclaim the continent. Slowly, cautiously, the bottleneck was loosening. By the later stages of the bottleneck, humans had developed a crucial trait that set them apart from nearly every other species: adaptability. Where most animals thrived only in specific habitats, humans could adjust. They could wear hides in the cold, build shelters against storms, and use fire to survive in darkness. They could invent solutions where none existed. This adaptability didn't erase danger. Life was still brutal, but it gave humanity a unique edge. It also shaped the human mind. Instead of relying purely on instinct, people learned to ask, what if? What if we hunt differently? What if we build stronger shelters? What if we move to new lands? These questions became survival strategies. Adaptability meant humans could imagine futures and prepare for them. And that single mental leap, thinking ahead, planning, imagining, was the bridge between survival and dominance. The bottleneck had crushed humanity down to nearly nothing, but it had also forged the very trait that would one day let us thrive everywhere on Earth. As populations slowly recovered, humans began to connect across greater distances. Previously, groups were so small and isolated that interaction was rare, often limited to chance encounters at waterholes or overlapping hunting ranges. But as numbers grew slightly, networks started forming. These weren't trade routes in the modern sense, but fragile lines of contact where ideas, tools, and even mates were exchanged. A group with a new tool-making technique might encounter another struggling with older methods. Instead of conflict, they might share knowledge, ensuring survival for both. These exchanges were critical. They prevented inbreeding by introducing genetic diversity and spread innovations faster than they could have otherwise. Even simple exchanges, flint from one region for shells from another, meant humans were thinking beyond their immediate environment. These first networks laid the foundation for the cooperative webs that would eventually span continents. But in the bottleneck years, they were lifelines, keeping humanity from collapsing into total isolation. Within each group, cooperation had always been vital, but during the bottleneck, it evolved into something more sophisticated. Hunting strategies became coordinated, involving not just brute strength, but planning and timing. Groups learned to drive animals into traps, ambushes, or natural enclosures, saugier. This required trust and coordination. If one hunter broke formation, the hunt could fail, costing everyone food. Over time, cooperation became instinctive. Children grew up seeing teamwork as the default. The ability to share tasks, distribute roles, and work toward common goals became a defining feature of humanity. Cooperation also extended beyond hunting. In building shelters, maintaining fire, and caring for the young, everyone contributed. Elders who could no longer hunt still shared wisdom, taught skills, and helped raise children. The survival of the group depended on this collective effort. Unlike many animals, where the weak are abandoned, humans developed systems that valued every member. This culture of cooperation not only kept them alive, but strengthened bonds, laying the emotional groundwork for future societies. The bottleneck acted as an evolutionary pressure cooker, not just biologically, but culturally. Every challenge demanded a new solution, and failure often meant death. This relentless pressure sparked innovation. Groups experimented constantly, new ways to sharpen tools, new methods to preserve food, new techniques to trap animals. Some experiments failed and were forgotten, but successful ones spread. A harsh environment rewarded creativity and punished stagnation. Over thousands of years, this cycle of problem-solving shaped a species that excelled at innovation. Unlike other animals that relied on instinctual behaviors, humans could reimagine their world. They learned not only from their own mistakes, but from the mistakes of others, passed down through stories and teaching. Innovation became a survival trait, embedded as deeply as hunting or firemaking. This mindset, seeing obstacles as challenges to overcome, was forged during the bottleneck and remains one of humanity's most powerful tools today. Though primitive, the beginnings of trade emerged during this period. Some resources were abundant in certain regions but scarce in others. Groups with access to high-quality flint for tools might encounter others who lived near rivers full of fish or coastlines with shells and salt. Exchanges began not with coins or contracts, but through mutual need. You share this, I share that. These early trades built trust and relationships between groups. They also spread culture. A group adopting a new tool from a neighbor might also adopt parts of their rituals or stories. Over time, these exchanges created invisible threads connecting distant communities, even if they never met directly. Trade wasn't yet about wealth. It was about survival. But in those fragile exchanges lay the first steps toward a global economy that would one day bind billions of humans together. By now, humanity had been defined by more than survival. It had been defined by resilience. Each generation grew up knowing that life was precarious, yet each also learned that persistence could overcome disaster. This resilience became more than a strategy. It became identity. Humans didn't just survive, they endured, adapted, and came back stronger after every setback. Stories around the fire reflected this. Heroes were not those who avoided hardship, but those who endured it. Groups passed down legends of ancestors who crossed deserts, outlasted winters, or defeated predators larger than themselves. These stories weren't just entertainment. They were lessons in resilience, teaching children that hardship was not an end but a test. By the close of the bottleneck, resilience had become the core of what it meant to be human. It was this identity that carried us forward, preparing our species not only to survive, but eventually to thrive in nearly every environment on Earth. After nearly 100,000 years of survival on the edge, humanity began a slow recovery. Populations that once hovered at just over 1,000 individuals started to climb, first to a few thousand, then tens of thousands. These changes were gradual, often taking thousands of years, but the trend was unmistakable. More people meant more chances for innovation, more genetic diversity, and more secure survival. Small bands grew into larger tribes. Where once firelight revealed only a handful of faces, now dozens could gather. This scale of social life was unprecedented, and it reshaped everything from cooperation to conflict. Larger groups meant safety in numbers, but also required stronger systems of leadership and shared rules. Humanity was no longer just surviving, they were laying the foundations for society. With recovery came movement. Groups began to push outward, exploring environments that had once been too dangerous or unknown. Some followed rivers deeper into fertile valleys. Others crossed mountain passes to reach new hunting grounds. Coastal groups learned to master fishing and shell gathering, while inland bands tracked herds across vast plains. Each new environment demanded adaptation. Along the way, humans left behind clues of their journeys. Stone tools scattered across landscapes, temporary shelters that became permanent camps. The expansion wasn't always smooth. New environments brought new predators, diseases, and rival groups. But each obstacle was met with the same adaptability forged in the bottleneck years. Slowly, humans spread farther and farther, taking the first steps toward populating the globe. As populations grew, so too did culture. Language became richer, with words for abstract concepts like time, distance, and even dreams. Art emerged. Not just scratches on stone, but deliberate creations. In caves, humans painted animals, hunts, and symbols whose meanings still puzzle us today. These weren't idle doodles, they were expressions of identity, belief, and community. Rituals grew more elaborate, with dances, songs, and burial practices that gave life structure and meaning. Culture was more than decoration, it was glue. It united larger groups, helped pass down knowledge, and gave people a sense of belonging in a dangerous world. The bottleneck had demanded cooperation, but now culture expanded that cooperation beyond blood ties. For the first time, humanity wasn't just surviving together. They were imagining together. The innovations of the bottleneck years blossomed into technological leaps. Tools became more specialized. Scrapers for hides, awls for piercing leather, blades for butchering. Spears evolved into more effective weapons with stone tips carefully crafted for durability and sharpness. Some groups even began experimenting with composite tools, binding different materials together for greater strength. Fire use advanced as well, with techniques for cooking that preserved nutrients and made more foods edible. Clothing grew more sophisticated, sewn with bone needles and sinew thread. These advances didn't happen overnight, but spread through growing networks of contact and exchange. Each step gave humans more control over their environment, lessening the constant vulnerability of their ancestors. Technology wasn't just about convenience, it was survival refined. And with it, the balance between humans and nature began to tilt. By the time humanity fully emerged from the bottleneck, the world was forever changed, not just ecologically, but genetically and culturally. That near extinction had shaped who we are at the deepest level. The fusion of chromosomes, the drive to innovate, the instinct to cooperate, the resilience to endure, all were sharpened in those desperate millennia. From a mere 1280 individuals, the human population eventually grew into billions. Yet every one of us carries within our DNA the memory of that struggle. Our capacity for imagination, culture, and progress is not an accident. It is the direct result of survival under impossible odds. The legacy of the bottleneck is not just that we survived, it's that we learned to thrive. From those tiny fires in the dark wilderness grew cities, civilizations, and the modern world. And though we may never face a challenge quite like that again, the resilience born in those 117,000 years is still with us, whispering that no matter how dire the circumstances, humanity endures. Though the bottleneck ended tens of thousands of years ago, its echoes remain within us. Every heartbeat, every breath, every step we take carries the genetic legacy of those 1280 survivors. Their endurance is written in our bones, their resilience etched into our immune systems, and their creativity alive in our minds. When modern humans build, explore, and dream, they are continuing a story that almost ended before it began. Even our instincts, our drive to form communities, our curiosity, our deep fear of isolation, trace back to those fragile groups who learned that survival was only possible together. We may live in skyscrapers, travel across the globe, and send machines into space, but inside us is still the same spirit that endured firelit nights in the wilderness. The survival struggle didn't just preserve life, it created the blueprint for who we are as a species. If those ancient ancestors could speak to us now, their message would not be one of fear, but of resilience. They would remind us that humanity has faced near extinction and still endured. They would tell us that every modern challenge, climate, conflict, uncertainty, carries within it the possibility of adaptation and renewal. The story of the bottleneck is not a tale of despair, but of hope, that even when reduced to the edge of nothingness, humanity can rise again. As we drift off to sleep with these thoughts, remember that you are the living proof of survival against impossible odds. You are part of a lineage that has weathered the harshest winters, outlasted predators, and crossed deserts with nothing but willpower. The struggle was long, the years were many, but in the end, humanity prevailed. And as long as we carry that legacy forward, there will always be another dawn after the darkest night.